The Black Gold Stranglehold: How Israel-Iran tensions could trigger the next great economic collapse. Picture this. It's 3 a.m. in Seoul, and factory lights across South Korea's industrial heartland begin flickering off, one by one. In Mumbai, taxi drivers abandon their vehicles as fuel prices triple overnight. In Berlin, the government announces emergency rationing measures not seen since World War II. This isn't science fiction. It's the potential reality of what historians may one day call the great energy stranglehold of the 2020s, triggered by an escalation between two nations whose conflict could literally turn off the lights of the modern world. The specter haunting the global economy isn't a ghost from Marx's imagination, but something far more tangible and terrifying. The Strait of Hormuz, a narrow waterway just 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, through which flows the lifeblood of modern civilization. Every day, approximately 21% of the world's petroleum liquids pass through this maritime chokepoint, making it the most strategically vital piece of real estate on Earth. And standing on opposite sides of this economic jugular are two nations whose animosity runs deeper than the oil wells beneath their feet: Israel and Iran. History has taught us that oil isn't just a commodity, it's a weapon of mass economic destruction. The 1973 oil crisis, triggered by the Yom Kippur War and subsequent Arab oil embargo, sent shockwaves through the global economy that lasted for years. Oil prices quadrupled virtually overnight, inflation soared to double digits, and entire industries ground to a halt. The United States, despite being a major oil producer, saw its economy contract by 3.2% in 1975. European nations implemented car-free Sundays and imposed speed limits to conserve fuel. The crisis fundamentally reshaped global politics and economics, proving that in the modern world, he who controls the oil controls the fate of nations. But the 1973 crisis pales in comparison to what a full-scale Israel-Iran conflict could unleash today. The global economy is now infinitely more interconnected, more dependent on just-in-time supply chains, and more vulnerable to disruption. Iran today controls not just significant oil reserves, but also the ability to close the Strait of Hormuz, effectively holding a gun to the head of the world economy. Iran's strategic thinking is brutally simple, yet devastatingly effective. Possessing the world's fourth-largest proven oil reserves and second-largest natural gas reserves, Iran has positioned itself as the gatekeeper of global energy flows. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has spent decades developing asymmetric warfare capabilities specifically designed to target the Strait of Hormuz. Their arsenal includes thousands of missiles, swarm boat tactics, underwater mines, and sophisticated anti-ship capabilities that could turn the strait into a maritime graveyard within hours of conflict eruption. Iranian military strategists understand that they don't need to win a conventional war. They simply need to make the cost of conflict so economically catastrophic that the world will pressure any aggressor to stand down. It's a strategy of economic mutually assured destruction, where Iran's own isolation becomes its greatest strength. When you have little to lose economically, threatening global economic stability becomes your most potent weapon. But here's where the story takes a chilling turn. Iran's calculations may be fatally flawed, and the consequences of their miscalculation could reshape the global order for generations. Israel's approach to the Iran challenge represents a fascinating study in how modern warfare has evolved. Unlike the broad military campaigns of previous eras, Israel has perfected the art of surgical precision, cyber warfare that can shut down nuclear facilities, targeted assassinations that eliminate key scientists, and intelligence operations that penetrate the highest levels of Iranian leadership. Israel's strategy isn't to occupy Iranian territory, but to systematically degrade Iran's nuclear capabilities while maintaining plausible deniability. However, this precision approach carries its own risks. Each successful Israeli operation pushes Iran closer to a point where restraint becomes politically impossible. Iranian leadership faces a stark choice: appear weak before their own people and regional proxies, or escalate dramatically to restore deterrence. History shows us that cornered regimes often choose escalation over humiliation. The technological dimension adds another layer of complexity. Israel's advanced military capabilities mean that any conflict would likely begin with devastating strikes against Iranian infrastructure. But Iran's asymmetric response capabilities mean that even a crippled Iran could still inflict massive economic damage through Strait of Hormuz operations, activation of proxy forces across the region, and cyber attacks against global energy infrastructure. The countries most vulnerable to an Israel-Iran oil crisis read like a roster of global economic powerhouses, making this not just a Middle Eastern problem but a worldwide catastrophe in waiting. Japan stands as perhaps the most vulnerable major economy, importing nearly 99% of its oil needs. Approximately 90% of Japan's oil passes through the Strait of Hormuz, making the nation entirely dependent on this single choke point. A closure would force Japan to immediately implement emergency measures reminiscent of the post-Fukushima energy crisis, but with no nuclear option to fall back on. The Japanese economy, still recovering from decades of stagnation, could face industrial collapse within weeks. South Korea shares Japan's vulnerability, with 85% of its oil imports transiting through the strait. The nation's massive shipbuilding, petrochemical, and manufacturing sectors would face immediate shutdowns. Samsung, LG, and Hyundai, global industrial giants, would see their supply chains severed, creating ripple effects throughout the global technology and automotive sectors. India, the world's third-largest oil consumer, imports 60% of its crude oil from the Middle East. The economic implications for a nation of 1.4 billion people are staggering. India's already fragile energy security would collapse, potentially triggering social unrest and political instability. The country's ambitious economic growth targets would become impossible to achieve, potentially condemning hundreds of millions to continued poverty. China, despite its diversified energy portfolio, still imports approximately 40% of its oil through the Strait of Hormuz. For a nation that has staked its political legitimacy on continuous economic growth, even a temporary oil shortage could trigger the kind of social instability that the Communist Party fears most. European Union nations, while less directly dependent on Middle Eastern oil than Asian countries, would face their own crisis. The EU's already strained energy security, exposed by the Russia-Ukraine conflict, would face another devastating blow. Germany's industrial engine would sputter, France's economic recovery would stall, and the Eurozone could face another existential crisis. The immediate impact of an Israel-Iran conflict would be oil prices skyrocketing to levels that make the 2008 crisis look manageable. Energy analysts predict prices could surge past $200 per barrel, a level that would trigger immediate global recession. But the true economic damage would extend far beyond energy costs. Global supply chains, already fragile from pandemic disruptions, would face complete breakdown. The cost of transporting goods would multiply, triggering inflation that central banks would be powerless to control. Airlines would ground fleets, shipping companies would face bankruptcy, and the entire logistics network that enables global commerce would collapse. Financial markets would experience carnage unprecedented since the 1929 crash. energy-dependent stocks would plummet, currencies of oil-importing nations would collapse, and sovereign debt crises would emerge as governments struggled to maintain basic services amid soaring energy costs. The agricultural sector would face particular devastation. Modern farming depends entirely on petroleum-based fertilizers and fuel for machinery. Food prices would spiral upward, potentially triggering famine in vulnerable regions and social unrest in developed nations. Here's the terrifying twist that makes this potential crisis uniquely dangerous. Both Israel and Iran may be operating under strategic assumptions that are no longer valid. Iran assumes that the global economy's dependence on Middle Eastern oil provides them with an unassailable deterrent. They believe that the world will never allow Israel to push them too far because the economic consequences would be unbearable. But this calculation fails to account for several crucial factors: the growth of American shale oil production, the increasing energy independence of major powers, and the accelerating transition to renewable energy. Israel, conversely, may believe that their technological superiority and alliance with the United States provides them with the capability to neutralize Iranian threats before they can be implemented. This assumption ignores Iran's distributed defensive capabilities and the reality that even a partially successful Iranian response could trigger global economic collapse. Both nations are playing a game of chicken with the global economy as the stakes, and history teaches us that such games often end in catastrophic collisions that no one intended. The current Israel-Iran standoff bears uncomfortable similarities to the pre-World War I European situation. Like the great powers of 1914, both nations have created alliance systems and military capabilities that make conflict increasingly likely while simultaneously making the consequences of conflict increasingly catastrophic. The mobilization schedules and interlocking alliances that made World War I inevitable have their modern equivalent in the automated trading systems and integrated supply chains that could turn a regional conflict into global economic collapse within hours. The lesson of 1914 is that when nations create systems designed to make war impossible through mutual assured destruction, they often instead make war inevitable by creating hair-trigger mechanisms that can be activated by miscalculation, accident, or the actions of third parties seeking to manipulate great power tensions. Every day that passes without resolution of the Israel-Iran nuclear standoff increases the probability of the catastrophic scenario described above. Iran's nuclear program continues to advance, Israeli patience continues to erode, and the economic interdependencies that make conflicts so dangerous continue to deepen. The tragedy is that both nations are rational actors operating according to logical strategic imperatives, yet their rational individual choices are creating an irrational collective outcome. Iran rationally seeks nuclear weapons to guarantee regime survival. Israel rationally seeks to prevent this outcome to guarantee its own survival. The collision of these rational strategies could irrationally destroy the global economic system that both nations depend upon. The question isn't whether the global economy can survive an Israel-Iran conflict over oil. The question is whether our leaders possess the wisdom to step back from a precipice that could define the next chapter of human history, one written in the darkness of extinguished factory lights and the chaos of collapsed civilizations. The black gold that built our modern world may yet become the catalyst for its undoing. And if it does, future historians will mark this moment as the time when humanity's greatest achievement, the interconnected global economy, became its greatest vulnerability.